In February of 1942, the first M4 Shermans were rolling off their production lines, ready to play a pivotal role in the war that America had just entered. But less than 3 months later, in May 1942, the first contracts had already been signed for the M4's replacement. However, as you may know, the M4's replacement didn't actually arrive in Europe until March 1945, and by that time, it looked something like this. This is, of course, the M26 Pershing, the vehicle that would be the template for the vast majority of US Cold War tank designs, right up to the M1 Abrams. But between the M4 and the M26 was an incredibly important family of medium tanks. This program was instrumental in the creation of the M26 Pershing, but also produced every major upgrade for the M4 Sherman, as well as testing features like autoloaders, electric drives, and radio control systems. In this video, I'm going to shed some light on the T20 series, from Sherman to Pershing and beyond. Even as the first Shermans were entering service, the Americans were looking ahead. The appearance of the Panzer IIIJ in Africa showed that German vehicles were trending towards greater firepower and improved armour. The Panzer IV F2 was soon to appear, with a 75mm high-velocity gun, already superior to the Sherman 75mm M3, and so work began on an improved vehicle. The designers recognised they needed a tank with more armour and a more powerful gun without sacrificing mobility. They needed the maximum armour for the minimum weight. Firstly, they redesigned the hull significantly. They simplified the hull into a box-like structure, removing the sponsons and choosing to put non-essential equipment outside of the armour in external stowage bins. This new vehicle also used a simplified front armour profile, with one roughly uniform slope at the front, 2.5 inches at 47 degrees. This casting would also incorporate a rotoclone ventilation blower, which would make the crew more comfortable while also expelling powder gases significantly faster. The engine in the rear was a low silhouette derivative of the Ford GAA, the engine of the M4A3 Sherman. The vehicle's transmission and drive sprocket were also rear-mounted, eliminating the need for linkages and complex front transmission casings and allowing for the powertrain to be removed as one piece, a power pack if you will. The mock-up of this new vehicle was revealed in May 1942. This tank, soon to be designated T20, had half an inch more armour than the M4, mounted a superior 76mm gun, used an automatic transmission, and had a lower silhouette for roughly equivalent weight. 2 pilots of the new T20 were soon approved. But the T20 was set to use unproven components, namely the transmission and the gun. To address this, more vehicles were proposed. The T22 was the safe option and used a manual transmission almost identical to that seen on the M4A3 Sherman. The T23 was a high-risk option using electric motors that had been developed from the T1E1. To add to the fun, variants of these 3 designs were also going to use different guns: the unproven 76mm T1, an auto-loading 75mm M3, or the 3-inch M7. These vehicles would be designated the T20, T20E1, and T20E2 respectively, expanded to the other 2 designs. Don't worry, this video will cover nearly 20 vehicles, but few of these original 9 survived. By the time these vehicles were being built, the 76mm had been successfully tested. This meant that the heavier but ballistically identical 3-inch was essentially obsolete, and no E2 vehicles were ever built. It also made the auto-loading 75mm gun significantly lower priority, and this was reduced to just one test platform, the T22E1. But before we get into the specs of these vehicles, a word from today's sponsor, Odoo. Odoo is an all-in-one management software, providing entrepreneurs with an entire suite of applications to simplify their day-to-day. Invoicing, accounting, inventory, project management, sales, Odoo does it all. But today, I want to show you Odoo's website creation app, and how I used it to transform my text-only YouTube scripts into a lovely military history blog. The website app on Odoo is so easy to use and gives you a great result almost immediately. You just define what type of site you want, your industry, your goals, pick a color palette or upload a logo, add some pages, and then pick whatever theme you think suits you best. From there, it's as simple as dragging and dropping in whatever blocks you need and inputting your content. It does look great from the start, but you can see here how in-depth the customization is. You can jazz up your images and layout, and even add in animations. But the best part, it's free. When you sign up for Odoo, your first app is free for life, including unlimited hosting and support. If your business grows, then so does Odoo, allowing you to add additional apps as you go. I love Odoo, it's a real pleasure to use, definitely try it out. Remember, your first app is completely free forever. But for now, let's see how the T20 pilot performed. Medium Tank T20 was completed in May 1943. This vehicle mounted the 76mm gun and used a Torquematic automatic transmission, promising to be significantly easier to drive. Another notable feature of the T20 was the use of horizontal volute spring suspension, or HVSS. Compared to vertical volute spring suspension, this offered, potentially, lower profile, lower ground pressure, simpler construction, and less danger of throwing a track over obstacles. Other than the bogies themselves, the rest of the components were identical to the M4: drive sprockets, road wheels, idlers, tracks, etc. On paper, the T20 was a pretty phenomenal tank. It's sometimes easy to assume that the Americans simply couldn't make a better tank than the Sherman, but that's not the case. This May 1943 vehicle was probably the best medium tank in the world when it was produced. The Panther was its only real competition, and it was far larger and heavier. The T20 was lighter, shorter, and lower than the equivalent Sherman, with a more powerful gun and thicker armour. It was also faster, topping out at some 56 km per hour. But unfortunately, it was significantly less reliable. The Torquematic transmission proved to be a real deal breaker for the T20. The test vehicle only managed 480 km in total, with a plethora of transmission breakdowns, oil leaks, and general engine overheating. It truly was a rival to the Panther in that regard. The T20E3 was plagued by the same issues. This vehicle, ordered in September 1942 and completed July 1943, was identical to the T20, aside from the fact it used a torsion bar suspension system, inspired by the T34 and KV1 and using components taken from the T70 GMC, the vehicle that would eventually become the M18 Hellcat. But T20E3 was heavier than T20 and far heavier than T70, so the suspension wasn't a good fit. It would need strengthened significantly if it was going to be practical. That and the transmission didn't really work. But of course, the T22 did not use that transmission. No, it used the same powertrain as the M4A3, just rearranged to fit into the T20's hull, and it was completed in June 1943. This single change made the vehicle 3 tons heavier than T20, and despite driving significantly farther during trials and suffering less transmission problems, it was a lot slower, at only 40 km per hour, and the engine cooling issues remained. The first of the 2 T22 pilots was converted into the single T22E1 in August 1943, the first tank to ever use an auto-loader. This novel system was installed in a smaller turret than used on the T20 and T22, as it only had to fit 2 men instead of 3. The autoloader itself used a spring rammer design and was fed by 2 32-round magazines in the turret basket, one each side of the gun. Usually one was for HE and one was for AP, and the commander could toggle between them. It's quite cool. Regardless, the 75mm gun was no longer considered adequate for any sort of anti-tank duties, and the design was shelved. It also wasn't all that reliable, despite firing around 20 rounds a minute. The T23 was a different beast altogether, using an electric drive adapted from the system used in the T1E1 heavy tank. The engine drove an electric generator, which then powered 2 individual traction motors, one for each track. This meant since the engine and tracks were not mechanically linked, the engine could run at its optimal speed all of the time, massively increasing its longevity. The first T23 was actually the first of the series to be completed back in January 1943, and this vehicle looks strange. Hint, it's the turret. This turret was welded and was part of the program to develop a turret suitable for the larger 76mm gun. The other turret was cast and was the one used on T20, T22 and the second T23 pilot vehicle. The welded turret had a slightly larger turret bustle and used a different mount, combination mount T80 instead of combination mount T79. T79 worked very similarly to that on the existing Sherman turrets, but T80 used a large, wide mantlet that spanned almost the entire turret front. You might see where that one's going. Initial tests of the first 2 T23 pilots and their respective turrets were extremely promising. The T23 was easy to drive and far more reliable than the T20 and T22, but the electric drive system needed some tweaks, especially in extreme conditions. Regardless, on June 3, 1943, the T23 was ordered into production, with 250 units ordered. These vehicles would not use the welded turret of the first pilot or the cast turret of the second. They'd use a new cast turret that had roughly the same dimensions as the welded turret, with the same T80 combination mount and new hatches on the roof. The turret had also been adapted slightly, with dimensions changed and ventilation added to allow it to be compatible with the Sherman hulls already in service. This turret would, of course, be adopted later for the 76mm armed M4s. Meanwhile, the hull had also been changed, with the armour thickness increased from 2.5 inches to 3. The weight was creeping up, more than 34 tons for a production T23. The first production vehicle left the factory in October 1943 and was sent to Aberdeen for proving, travelling over 7,000 gruelling kilometres. Perhaps to expedite the adoption of T23, the decision had been made to use an identical suspension system to the Sherman, VVSS bogies with 19-inch track. However, the T23 was faster and heavier than the M4, so the suspension soon started to fail. Soviet observers noted the tyres and the road wheels began to visibly disintegrate during the test program. Further testing of the first 10 production vehicles also revealed that while the electric drive transmission system was objectively superior when driving the tank, the maintenance required was far more intensive and had to be conducted by specially trained crews. The tens of thousands of tank crews and maintenance men already in the army would essentially need to be retrained on the vehicle if it was to ever enter combat, which at this point was looking less and less likely. However, from the T23 spawned two new vehicles, the T25 and T26. So, as the order was placed for the 250 production T23s, 50 of them would be adapted to carry the new 90mm gun in a larger turret. 40 of these would use the same armour as T23. This was T25. The other 10 would have heavier armour, T26. This vehicle, the T26, will be roughly equivalent in armour and firepower to the German Tiger I. However, if you haven't noticed, the engine is still the same 500 horsepower power plant used in the M4, and the weight of these new vehicles was getting worrying. The electric transmission was relatively heavy, so in a weight-saving measure it was swapped out for the Torquematic transmission. And yes, this is the same type that failed on the far lighter T20, but as the T70 program had progressed, many of the kinks had been worked out, and it was once again a viable transmission option. At the same time, the development of the torsion bar suspension system had also progressed, so both tanks would use the Torquematic transmission and torsion bars, and would be designated the T25E1 and the T26E1, with 76mm and 102mm of armour respectively. The extra 5 tons of weight meant that the T26E1 suspension had to be widened from 19 inches to 24 in order to spread the weight, with new track links and road wheels designed for this new vehicle. Pilots of both vehicles would arrive in early 1944, with T23s, T25E1s and T26E1s all in production at the same time. The first two T26E1s completed initial testing in May 1944, and everything looked great, actually. Well, as great as it gets for a development vehicle. The transmission, suspension and gun all functioned well, but there were still some engine cooling issues to fix, the radiators kept filling up with mud, and there were concerns about the low amount of 90mm ammunition that could be carried, only 42 rounds. The higher-ups over in Europe wanted 70 shells minimum. This was solved by redesigning and slimming down the turret basket and getting rid of the wet stowage bins. Sacrificing the wet stowage dividers and tub allowed the floor racks and additional turret racks to hold the 70 rounds required. Who needs to survive when you could fire 28 more rounds after all? Another issue was the fact that the 90mm gun kicked up a ridiculous amount of dust. The solution was the addition of a double baffle muzzle brake. The narrow 19-inch tracks of the T25E1 were also proving to be an issue, and the plan was to fit the suspension of the T26E1 on instead. However, by summer 1944, given the appearance of Panthers and Tigers in Europe, there was almost no interest in the T25E1, and all attention was on the T26E1 with its heavier armour. So much so, in fact, that the T26E1 was redesignated a heavy tank in June. It doesn't change anything, of course, but it made the troops feel better, or at least that was the intention. These modifications were incorporated onto the next iteration of the T26, the T26E3. 250 vehicles were ordered, and production began in November 1944, with the first 10 delivered by the end of the month. Okay, let's pause a second before we get carried away and do some due diligence on the vehicles we may have glossed over. We've been following the T25E1 and T26E1, but the regular T25 and T26 did exist. The T25 was even built at the same time, back in January 1944. Built from a modified T23, T25 used the same electric drive as its predecessor, and so was far heavier than the T25E1 at around 38 tons. As a result, it used the more modern HVSS bogies on a 23-inch track, trying to spread that weight out. However, the general lack of interest in T25 drastically slowed development, and the project was shelved in late 1944. Meanwhile, two other vehicles were being worked on, the T23E3 and T26. These were cobbled together from salvaged Torquematic vehicles, a T25E1 and T26E1 respectively, and were built to assess the electric drive transmissions with torsion bar suspension systems. The T26, completed in October 1944, was found to be superior to both the T26E1 and E3 in normal operation, but the Torquematic tanks were far more reliable, easier to drive in inclined terrain, and easier to maintain. Electric drive tanks were simply not going anywhere for now, and both vehicles were shelved. In December, another T23 was converted, this time to use the same HVSS suspension and tracks as the M4E8 Shermans. The conclusion was that the new system was better than the old one, but that electric drive tanks were still too much hassle. Very informative. Okay, we're all caught up, let's go into combat. As the T26 E3s were rolling off their production lines in November 1944, the decision was made to send them to Europe. Major General Barnes, Chief of Ordnance Department R&D, was convinced they were urgently needed over there, and proposed that of the first 40 T26 E3s produced, 20 should be sent to Europe and 20 should be sent to Aberdeen for testing. These 20 T26 E3s were shipped to Belgium in January 1945, along with Barnes himself, a selection of military higher-ups, and two civilians, Bill Shaw from the Fisher Tank Arsenal and Slim Price, who was an expert on the 90mm gun. These tanks, their crews, and these experts were given the codename Zebra and were soon sent to the front line, split equally between the 3rd and 9th Armoured. By the end of February, all the tanks were in place and their crews had been thoroughly trained, with Slim Price conducting gunnery classes on the new 90mm gun. 3rd Armoured were the first to use T26E3 in combat, attacking across the Roa River on the 25th. The first casualty was just 3 days later, serial number 38 assigned to F Company, 33rd Armoured Regiment. This vehicle, named Fireball, had been fired upon by a Tiger while manning a roadblock. The Tiger had shot Fireball 3 times with its 88mm gun from a distance of just 100 yards. The first shot penetrated the coaxial machine gun port and killed 2 men. The second shot hit the muzzle brake, and the last glanced off the upper edge of the turret. The Tiger had then reversed and got stuck in debris before it too was abandoned. The T26E3s soon got some kills of their own. The very next day, this vehicle destroyed a Tiger and 2 Panzer IVs, firing 3 shots at each during combat in Elsdorf. On March the 6th, one T26E3 was hit by a Nashorn at a distance of 300 yards, the shell penetrating the front plate, going between the driver's legs and starting a fire in the turret. The crew escaped, but the tank was completely destroyed. This would end up being the only vehicle from Zebra to not be in active service at the end of the war, as the rest were repaired and returned to action. Also on March 6th, a Zebra mission T26E3 embedded in the 32nd Armour Regiment was involved in one of the most famous tank duels in history, knocking out a Panther tank in front of the Cologne Cathedral with 3 rounds of T33 ammunition, and avenging a Sherman that had been knocked out by the Panther just moments before. During this attack, another T26 destroyed a Tiger and a third destroyed a Panzer IV. Following these skirmishes in March, the T26E3 was finally approved for service and standardised as the heavy tank M26, the Pershing. While Zebra Mission had been fighting Tigers and Panthers in Germany with the T26E3, 3 other variants of the vehicle were in development or test: the E2, E4 and E5. The E2 was armed with a 105mm howitzer that had been deployed on the M4, and the plan was to initially produce more Pershings with the 105 than with the 90, but this soon fell out of favour when the 90 showed how capable it really was. The T26E2 would eventually be adopted as the M45. Starting in July 1945, 185 vehicles would end up being produced, and despite it missing World War II, the M45 did serve in Korea. The T26E4 was the opposite. This mounted a significantly larger gun. If the 90mm M3 was equivalent to the Tiger's KWK-36, this new 90mm T15 was equivalent to the King Tiger's KWK-43, longer and firing shells at a far higher velocity, but mounting it in a T26E1 proved challenging. Firstly, the gun was so long and so heavy that the tanks had to mount equilibrator springs above the mantlet and a large counterweight on the bustle to try and balance the turret, while the shells were so long that it was almost impossible to load them into the gun. The first pilot, converted from a T26E1, used single-piece ammunition and the 90mm T15E1 gun. The second pilot was converted from a T26E3 and used two-piece ammunition with the revised 90mm T15E2 gun. It was the first pilot that was sent into combat in Europe. The so-called Super Pershing arrived at 3rd Armoured on the 15th of March 1945. It did arrive without any ammunition or a main gun sight, but this mystery was soon solved when men from the 635th Tank Destroyer Battalion started asking whether 90mm rounds were about 12.5 inches too long. Before it entered combat, the Super Pershing was up-armoured in an attempt to put it on more equal terms with the King Tiger. An 80mm thick plate of Panther armour was welded to the front of the gun shield, and more armour plate was added to the front of the hull, increasing the slope considerably. At some point, these extra wings were added to the turret cheeks to further increase protection, but it's not clear when or where this happened. Some sources are convinced that the T26E4 destroyed multiple vehicles during fighting in Dessau in April 1945, with many declaring one of the destroyed vehicles was in fact a King Tiger. Nobody knows for sure what the E4 fired at or destroyed, but the nearest known King Tigers were around 70 miles from Dessau at the time. Super Pershing versus King Tiger is a more interesting story than Super Pershing versus Panzer IV though. Back in the US, the T26E4 was being adapted for large-scale production, with 25 production E4s built. These had the improvements made on the T26E3 and the second T26E4, and are identified by the fact the equilibrator springs had been redesigned to be internal. The end of the war meant that only the first 25 vehicles would ever be produced, and they were evaluated until early 1947. Okay, we've had small gun and big gun, what about medium gun with big armour? This is the T26E5. I do have a dedicated video about this vehicle, but it is essentially a Pershing Jumbo, a T26E3 beefed up with an extra 5 metric tons of armour, 6 extra inches on the hull, and 11 extra inches on the mantlet. The first T26E5 didn't get delivered until July 1945 and was deemed suitable for service, with the caveat being that the vehicle was slower and caused more wear on the suspension. With 27 vehicles produced, the end of the war ended the E5 project, but it did not end development of the M26. The M26E1 project had begun in July and was an attempt to implement the longer, more powerful gun of the T26E4 in a more sensible package. This new weapon, the 90mm T54, offered the same ballistic performance with a more suitable one-piece round. They made it shorter and fatter. They also implemented a new concentric recoil system for the T54, as well as reducing the size of the muzzle brake by machining off the second baffle. During testing in February 1947, the E1 was found to be an excellent vehicle, with the 90mm T54 being touted as the best tank gun the US had ever produced. However, in this post-war environment, nobody was really interested in spending money on a new gun, and the E1 project was shelved. You'd think it might have resurfaced when the decision had been made to modernise the M26 in 1948, but this project went a different direction. In fact, it was a different vehicle altogether. The M26E2 project soon became the T40, which later became the M46 Patton. Check out my first Patton series video for details on that project, as well as how it developed further into the M47 and M48. Elements from the M46 development did feed back into the Pershing and were adopted as the M26A1, mounting the modernised 90mm M3A1 with a slimmed down muzzle brake and fume extractor. All three of these vehicles, M26, M26A1 and M46, would serve in Korea, proving to be more than a match for the T-34-85s they fought against. This allowed direct comparison and testing of their respective powertrains, with the M26 suffering significantly more breakdowns during its time on the peninsula. Of course, the M26 being an American vehicle, there were a whole host of spin-offs and other variants, but unfortunately I don't have time to go into them in enough detail to really do them justice. The development history of the Pershing is not simple, in case you hadn't noticed, and I hope my walkthrough made some sense. As new powertrains, suspensions, guns and armour requirements were fed into the program, the T20 series was forever just not quite good enough. Instead, the T20s were largely used to test new equipment and new weapons, feeding these back into the M4 to allow those vehicles to stay relevant throughout the war. When the demand came from Europe, the T26E3 was ready, and its successful combat debut and adoption showed that the Pershing was a good design. Was it perfect? No. When troops asked Captain Elmer Gray of Zebra Mission if the Pershing was as good as the King Tiger and Panther, he replied, "Hell no. but it's the best tank we have yet developed, and we should have had it a year earlier. The development of the Pershing and its delays were largely due to politics, changing requirements, denial about German capabilities, and strange inter-service rivalries. Army ground forces thought the 90mm wasn't required, and had initially requested 6,000 T25E1s and T26E1s armed with the 75mm and 76mm guns. Fighting in Normandy meant that they had quickly changed their opinion. And yes, it's easy to point to a 45-ton heavy tank with the same engine as the Sherman and ask why they had not considered replacing it. And of course they eventually did, but engines do not grow on trees, and there simply wasn't a suitable alternative power plant. The T28 super heavy tank had the same engine after all, and it weighed 85 metric tons. Anyway, the N26 was roughly equal in firepower, armour and mobility to vehicles like the Tiger and Panther, and was put into service soon enough to see combat, unlike similar vehicles like the T44 and Centurion. It doesn't sound too bad to me. I think because the superior M46 was deemed to be a completely separate vehicle, the M26 was never really given the respect it deserved. Whatever you think about the M26 itself, the T20 series formed the basis for American tank development during the entirety of the 20th century, and the technologies tested on these vehicles are still relevant today. Torsion bar suspension systems, electric drives, autoloaders, and automatic transmissions, just to name a few. I also just think they're handsome little tanks. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you learned something, and I'd encourage you to watch the original Patton video. Apparently I'm doing a sort of Star Wars-esque thing where I do original trilogy, then prequels, then sequels. Except I hope that these prequels and sequels will actually be good. Anyway, do like this video and subscribe to see the next ones. If you do want to support the channel further, I'd appreciate it if you'd consider becoming a Patreon subscriber. Exclusive videos, early access to my YouTube uploads, and entry into my Discord. Thanks again to all my existing supporters. I couldn't do it without you. I'll see you next time.